At exactly 0147 hours, on July 23, 1945, 55 pounds of high explosive detonated beneath a Japanese locomotive traveling at 45 miles per hour along the Karafuto coastline. The boiler ruptured instantly. Superheated steam mixed with burning metal fragments shot 200 feet into the air. The engine disintegrated into 3 sections. 16 freight cars carrying Japanese troops and ammunition slammed into the wreckage at full speed, creating a fireball visible from 700 yards offshore, where USS Barb sat watching. This was the only Allied ground combat operation on Japanese home island soil during the entire Pacific War. And it started with 8 ordinary sailors, 2 rubber rafts, and a pickle jar full of batteries. But let me take you back to June 1945. The Pacific War was entering its final phase. American forces had captured Okinawa. B-29 bombers were burning Japanese cities to ash. The Imperial Japanese Navy was destroyed. Merchant shipping had vanished from the ocean. American submarines were running out of targets. Commanders who had spent 3 years hunting enemy convoys now patrolled empty seas. The submarine force had done its job too well. Japan's supply lines were strangled. Their economy was collapsing. But the war wasn't over. Japanese forces were preparing for the final battle. Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the home islands. 2 million soldiers dug into fortified positions across Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku. Coastal railroads moved troops and ammunition to defensive positions. Factory towns along the shoreline produced military supplies around the clock. These targets were previously untouchable. Submarines carried torpedoes designed for ships, not shore installations. Aircraft bombers could hit factories, but not trains moving at night through blackout conditions. The situation created a strategic gap. Japanese military logistics continued functioning despite American naval dominance. Trains ran 6 times daily along the Karafuto coastline, each carrying 40 to 60 soldiers plus ammunition and supplies. These soldiers would kill Americans when invasion forces landed. Every train that reached its destination meant more casualties when the beaches turned red. Someone needed to stop those trains. The answer came from an unexpected source. Commander Eugene Fluckey stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, 31 years old, born in Washington, D.C. Naval Academy graduate, class of 1935. He had commanded USS Barb for 5 war patrols, sinking 17 enemy ships, totaling 96,000 tons. 3 months earlier, President Truman had awarded him the Medal of Honor for the most audacious submarine attack of the war. January 1945. Nam Quan Harbor, off the coast of China. Fluckey had taken Barb into water so shallow the submarine couldn't dive, with minefields on both sides and Japanese destroyers patrolling the entrance, then destroyed 8 merchant ships and escaped at high speed through uncharted waters while depth charges exploded around them. 0 American casualties. The brass at Pearl Harbor called Fluckey brilliant, but reckless. His crew called him Lucky Fluckey, though luck had nothing to do with it. The man calculated risks like a mathematician, studied enemy patterns like a scientist, and attacked with the precision of a surgeon. But what made Fluckey truly dangerous wasn't his tactical genius. It was his refusal to accept limitations. When told submarines couldn't do something, he asked, "Why not?" and then proved everyone wrong. Before Barb's 12th and final war patrol, Fluckey approached the Navy's research and development staff with an unusual request. He wanted rockets. The Mark 51 launcher system held 12 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets, each carrying 10 pounds of high explosive, with a maximum range of 3 miles. The Navy was testing them as anti-kamikaze weapons for landing ships. Flecky convinced them to bolt one launcher onto Barb's forward deck. It made her the only rocket-launching submarine in the United States Navy. Nobody had ever tried this before. The engineers said it might work. Flecky said it would work. USS Barb departed Midway on June 8, 1945, loaded with 72 rockets and orders to raise hell along the Japanese coast. The Gato-class submarine displaced 2,400 tons submerged and carried a crew of 80 men. She was one of the most decorated submarines in the Pacific Fleet. 4 Presidential Unit citations, 8 battle stars, Navy Unit commendation. But decorations don't sink ships. Torpedoes do. And rockets. And apparently trains, though nobody knew that yet. Barb reached the waters north of Hokkaido on June 20th. 2 days later, at 0230 hours on June 22nd, Flecky surfaced 3 miles off the town of Sherry. Population 20,000. Industrial district producing military supplies. The submarine turned broadside to shore. Flecky gave the order. 12 rockets ripple-fired in 5 seconds, screaming through darkness and slamming into Sherry's waterfront. Fires erupted across the factory district. Barb submerged and disappeared before Japanese forces could respond. It was the first time in history a submarine had launched rockets against a shore target. Over the next 3 weeks, Barb fired 60 more rockets at factory towns along the Hokkaido and Karafuto coasts. Shikuka, Kashiho, Shiratori. Japan's largest paper mill destroyed. A leather tanning factory that made pilot uniforms burning. Small shipyards reduced to wreckage. Flecky also used Barb's 4-inch deck gun to shell military installations. The submarine operated with complete impunity. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft hunted for her, but Flecky kept moving, kept striking, kept the enemy off balance. Then, on July 19th, while patrolling off southern Karafuto, Flecky noticed something through the periscope. A railroad running within 400 yards of the coastline. Trains moving north and south throughout day and night. Locomotives pulling freight cars filled with troops and military cargo. The trains represented a supply line feeding Japanese forces preparing to resist American invasion. Flecky watched for 3 days, counting schedules, studying terrain. The beach was accessible. The tracks were vulnerable. An idea began forming. The problem was obvious. Barb could surface and shell the railroad with her deck gun, but that would only damage tracks. Japanese engineers would repair them within hours. What Flecky wanted was to destroy a moving train. Maximum damage, maximum disruption, maximum psychological impact. But submarines didn't carry weapons designed for land targets. Torpedoes were useless. Rockets lacked precision for moving targets. The deck gun couldn't track a train through coastal terrain. Flecky needed a different solution. Something the Japanese wouldn't expect. Something no submarine had ever attempted. On the evening of July 22nd, Chief Gunner's Mate Paul Saunders and Electrician's Mate 3rd Class Billy Hatfield sat in Barb's cramped forward torpedo room with a problem. Flecky had asked them to devise a way to blow up a train without risking a shore party during the explosion. Hatfield stared at the 55-pound scuttling charge, the device designed to destroy Barb if the crew had to abandon her to prevent capture. Then he remembered a childhood trick, placing walnuts on railroad tracks so the weight of passing trains would crack them open. What if they could rig the scuttling charge the same way? a micro switch buried under the rails, the weight of a locomotive closing the circuit. The train would destroy itself. Hatfield explained his idea to Saunders. The chief gunner's mate was silent for 30 seconds. Then he smiled. It was insane. It was brilliant. It might actually work. They spent the next 4 hours constructing a prototype. A simple pressure switch salvaged from submarine components. 3 dry cell batteries wired in series. The 55-pound scuttling charge packed with enough explosive to vaporize a locomotive. The entire assembly fit inside an empty pickle jar for waterproofing. When a train's weight depressed the rails even a quarter inch, the micro switch would complete the electrical circuit. Detonation would occur directly beneath the locomotive's boiler. Hatfield estimated the explosion would destroy at least the first 3 cars and derail everything behind them. The engineering was sound, but the mission itself presented enormous risks. Barb would need to surface within 1,000 yards of the Japanese coastline. A shore party would paddle inflatable rafts to the beach, cross 400 yards of enemy territory, plant the explosive, and return before dawn. If Japanese patrols discovered them, the men would be trapped on hostile soil with no support and no escape route. If the submarine was spotted while surfaced in shallow water, she couldn't dive quickly enough to evade attack. Flucky calculated they would have roughly 90 minutes from the moment rafts launched until Barb had to submerge. 90 minutes to paddle ashore, bury 55 pounds of explosives beneath railroad tracks, and escape. 90 minutes before Japanese coastal artillery turned the ocean into a killing zone. Flucky presented the plan to his officers. The room went silent. Lieutenant William Walker was the first to speak. He said it was suicidal. Then he volunteered to lead the shore party. Every man aboard Barb raised his hand when Flucky asked for volunteers. 80 sailors, willing to paddle onto enemy soil with shovels and explosives. The commander established strict criteria. First, unmarried men only. He refused to create widows. Second, physical fitness and swimming ability. Third, preferably former Boy Scouts. Fourth, a mix of skills. Flucky selected 8 men. Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders, 26 years old, would lead the shore party. Electrician's mate Billy Hatfield would handle the explosive device. He had worked for the railroad before the war and understood track construction. Signalman Francis Sever. Ship's cook Lawrence Newland. Torpedoman Edward Klinglesmith. Motor machinist James Richard. Motor machinist John Markison. And Lieutenant William Walker as officer in charge. But before they could execute this crazy plan, they needed one critical element: weather. Flucky needed cloud cover to hide the 3/4 moon. Clear skies would illuminate the submarine and rafts, making them visible to Japanese sentries. For 4 days, Barb patrolled off Karafuto while the crew watched the sky. Clear. Clear. Clear again. Only 5 days remained in their patrol schedule. The window was closing. Then, on the afternoon of July 22nd, cirrus clouds appeared on the horizon. By evening, stratus clouds were capping mountain peaks along the Karafuto coast. Cloud cover was building from the west. Flucky made the decision. They would execute tonight. At 2300 hours on July 22nd, USS Barb began her approach to the Karafuto coastline, running slowly on electric motors to reduce noise, with 8 men preparing to become the first American ground combat troops to set foot on Japanese home island soil during the entire Pacific War. Armed with nothing but shovels, a pickle jar, and the most audacious plan any submarine commander had ever conceived. So Flucky had proven submarines could launch rockets at shore targets. 60 rockets fired over 3 weeks. Factory towns burning, paper mills destroyed, leather tanneries reduced to ash. The Japanese were terrified. But rockets couldn't destroy moving trains. Torpedoes couldn't hit railroad tracks. And now, Flucky was proposing something insane. He wanted to put men ashore on Japanese sovereign territory. Enemy soil. Home islands. The place where no American ground forces had ever set foot during the entire Pacific War. His officers thought he'd lost his mind. The evening after Flucky announced his plan, Lieutenant William Walker requested a private meeting in the captain's cabin. Walker was 28 years old, Annapolis graduate, 4 war patrols under his belt. He respected Flucky more than any commander he'd served under. But this mission crossed a line. Walker closed the cabin door and spoke carefully. "Sir, with respect, this is suicide. We surface within 1,000 yards of shore, shallow water. No room to dive if patrol boats appear. We send 8 men onto enemy territory with no support. If they're discovered, they're dead. If we're spotted, we're dead. And for what? 1 train?" Flucky looked at his navigation charts. The railroad running along the Karafuto coastline. 6 trains per day. 40 to 60 soldiers per train. That meant 240 to 360 enemy troops moving south every single day to defensive positions. In 1 week, over 2,000 soldiers. In 1 month, nearly 10,000. These were the men who would kill Americans when invasion forces hit the beaches. Flucky turned to Walker. "Lieutenant, how many Marines do you think will die taking those beaches? How many soldiers? 10,000? 20,000? If we can cut that supply line, even for a few days, we save American lives. That's the job." Walker was silent for 10 seconds. Then he said, "Permission to lead the shore party, sir." Flucky smiled. "Denied. You're too valuable. I need you supervising from Barb's deck." Walker protested. Flucky was firm. They argued for 15 minutes. Finally, Flucky agreed. Walker could go ashore, but Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders would command the actual operation. Walker would be there as officer in charge, but Saunders called the tactical shots. Walker accepted. But convincing Walker was the easy part. The real problem was the device itself. Billy Hatfield's idea sounded brilliant in theory. Bury explosives under the rails. Weight-activated microswitch. Train destroys itself. Simple. Except nothing about this was simple. Hatfield had never built a device like this before. Nobody had. There were no blueprints, no manuals, no specifications. He was improvising from childhood memories of cracking walnuts on railroad tracks. If the microswitch was positioned too deep, the rail wouldn't depress enough to trigger it. Too shallow, and vibrations from wind or thermal expansion might cause premature detonation, killing the shore party while they were still digging. Hatfield needed to test the concept. But how do you test a railroad bomb inside a submarine? You can't exactly lay railroad tracks in the torpedo room. Hatfield spent 2 days thinking through the engineering. The critical variable was pressure sensitivity. Japanese locomotives weighed between 60 and 80 tons. That weight, distributed across 6 to 8 wheels, meant each wheel exerted roughly 8 to 10 tons of downward force. When a wheel passed over a section of rail, the steel would compress the wooden ties and ballast beneath it, causing the rail to depress approximately 1/4 to 1/2 inch. The microswitch needed to close its circuit somewhere within that 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch range. Too sensitive, and the device might detonate from a handcart or maintenance crew walking the tracks. Not sensitive enough, and the locomotive would roll right over it without triggering. Hatfield calculated that 3/8 of an inch depression was the optimal trigger point. Now he needed to build a switch that would reliably close at exactly that distance under field conditions. Salt water, dirt, vibration, extreme pressure, temperature variations. This wasn't laboratory work. This was combat engineering with salvaged submarine parts. Hatfield raided Barb's electrical stores. He found a simple relay switch designed for the submarine's ballast system. The switch had an adjustable tension spring. By carefully calibrating the spring tension, Hatfield could set the exact pressure required to close the contacts. He spent 18 hours testing different configurations. Each test involved manually compressing the switch with measured weights, checking continuity with a multimeter. Too tight. Too loose. Too tight again. Finally, on the 19th attempt, he found the sweet spot. The switch would close reliably under 8 tons of pressure, which meant any locomotive wheel passing directly over it would trigger the detonation. But there was another problem. Electrical circuits and dirt don't mix. The microswitch, batteries, and wiring would be buried 6 to 8 inches beneath railroad ballast. Moisture in the soil could short the circuit. Rocks could damage the switch housing. Japanese track inspectors might spot disturbed gravel and investigate. Hatfield needed waterproofing and camouflage. He requisitioned an empty pickle jar from the galley. Glass was waterproof and wouldn't interfere with the electrical circuit. The scuttling charge fit inside with the batteries, but the microswitch had to remain outside the jar, positioned directly beneath the rail where the locomotive's weight would depress it. Hatfield designed a clever solution. He sealed the batteries and detonator inside the pickle jar with waterproof rubber gaskets. The wires exited through holes drilled in the lid, also sealed with rubber compound. The microswitch itself was wrapped in multiple layers of waxed canvas, creating a weatherproof envelope that would protect it from moisture while still allowing mechanical compression. The entire assembly could be buried and would remain functional for at least 72 hours, probably longer. After that, corrosion might compromise the contacts. But 72 hours was more than enough time. Trains ran every 4 hours along that section of track. The device would trigger long before corrosion became an issue. On July 20th, Hatfield demonstrated his creation to Fluckey and the senior officers. They gathered in the forward torpedo room. Hatfield had constructed a mock-up using wooden planks to simulate railroad ties and a section of steel pipe to represent the rail. He placed the microswitch assembly beneath the pipe, covered it with dirt and gravel from the ballast tanks, then connected the batteries and scuttling charge. Everything was live, functional, armed. Hatfield explained the trigger mechanism, then carefully lowered a 50-pound weight onto the pipe section above the buried microswitch. Nothing happened. The officers looked confused. Hatfield added another 50-pound weight. Still nothing. Then he added a third weight, 150 pounds total. The pipe depressed slightly into the dirt. Click. The microswitch closed. A small red indicator light connected to the circuit illuminated. If this had been the actual scuttling charge, the explosion would have occurred at that exact moment. The officers were impressed. Lieutenant Walker asked the critical question. What if a maintenance crew walks the tracks? What if someone steps on it? Hatfield shook his head. A man weighs maybe 200 pounds. Spread across 2 feet, that's 100 pounds per square foot. Not enough pressure to depress the rail. The locomotive wheel concentrates 16,000 pounds onto a contact patch about 3 inches across. That's what triggers it. Nothing else. Fluckey was satisfied. The device worked. But now came the really dangerous part. Actually executing the mission. Shore parties were nothing new in submarine warfare. American subs had landed reconnaissance teams before. They'd evacuated refugees. They'd delivered supplies to Filipino guerrillas. But those missions happened in friendly or neutral territory. This was different. This was Japanese home island soil. If captured, the men wouldn't be treated as prisoners of war. They'd be executed as saboteurs. The Geneva Convention didn't protect combatants operating behind enemy lines in civilian clothes. Fluckey established his selection criteria. Unmarried men only, no widows. Physical fitness and swimming ability required. Preferably former Boy Scouts who understood navigation and emergency procedures. Mix of skills: electrician, diggers, experienced sailors. When he announced the mission and asked for volunteers, every single man aboard USS Barb raised his hand. 80 sailors volunteering for a suicide mission. Fluckey was proud and frustrated. He could only take 8. He spent 2 hours reviewing personnel files, conducting interviews, making the hardest decision of his command. The final roster. Paul Saunders leading. Billy Hatfield handling explosives. Francis Sever as signalman. Lawrence Newland, the ship's cook with farm experience and strong back. Edward Klinglesmith, torpedoman. James Richard, motor machinist. John Markison, motor machinist. William Walker as officer in charge. 8 men who would become the only American ground combat troops to operate on Japanese home islands during World War II. They began training immediately. Barb's engineers fabricated improvised tools from engine room steel plates, bending and welding them into picks and shovels. The shore party practiced paddling the rubber rafts in darkness. They rehearsed the burial procedure, using sandbags to simulate the scuttling charge. But there was one element they couldn't control: weather. Fluckey needed cloud cover to hide the 3/4 moon. Clear skies meant the submarine and rafts would be visible from shore. Japanese sentries would spot them instantly. Coastal artillery would open fire before the rafts even reached the beach. For 4 frustrating days, Barb patrolled off Karafudo under cloudless skies. Clear. Clear. Clear again. Time was running out. Only 5 days remained in their patrol schedule. After that, fuel and supply levels would force them back to Midway. Then, on July 22nd, at 1400 hours, the barometric pressure began dropping. Cirrus clouds appeared on the western horizon. By 1800 hours, stratus clouds were building over the coastal mountains. The weather was changing. Fluckey studied the cloud formations through the periscope. The cloud layer would reach maximum coverage around midnight. Perfect timing. He made the call. They would execute tonight. Mission was go. The shore party assembled in the forward torpedo room at 2200 hours. Hatfield carefully packed the pickle jar containing the batteries and scuttling charge. Saunders distributed waterproof flashlights, pistols, and the digging tools. Each man wore dark clothing and a Mae West life vest. Walker reviewed the timeline one final time. Launch rafts at 0005 hours. Reach beach by 0030. Cross to railroad by 0050. Bury device and arm circuit by 0130. Return to beach by 0145. Board Barb by 0200 before first light at 0215. Total mission time, exactly 115 minutes. No margin for error. No backup plan. If Japanese patrols discovered them, the shore party would die on that beach. If Barb was spotted while surfaced in 36 feet of water, the submarine couldn't dive fast enough to escape. Everyone aboard understood the stakes. At 2300 hours, USS Barb began her final approach to the Karafuto coastline, running silent on electric motors, with 8 men preparing to paddle into enemy territory, carrying the most audacious weapon any submarine crew had ever devised. And waiting on the beach in complete darkness were Japanese sentries, guard dogs, and coastal artillery positions that could turn the next 2 hours into a massacre that would end with 0 survivors and 1 submarine at the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk. So Flucky had built a submarine that launched rockets. Hatfield had invented a railroad bomb inside a pickle jar. 8 volunteers were ready to paddle onto Japanese home island soil. The device was tested. The plan was set. Timeline calculated down to the minute. But this wasn't a training exercise. This was real. Japanese sentries patrolled that coastline. Guard dogs, coastal artillery. 1 mistake meant 8 men dead, and 1 submarine at the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk. And now, at 2300 hours on July 22, 1945, USS Barb was approaching the Karafuto shore in waters so shallow she couldn't dive, with every man aboard knowing the next 2 hours would either make history or become their grave. The Japanese weren't stupid. After 3 weeks of rocket attacks along the Hokkaido and Karafuto coasts, they knew an American submarine was operating in their waters. Reconnaissance aircraft had been searching the Sea of Okhotsk daily since June 22nd, when Sherry burned. Military command in Sapporo ordered increased coastal patrols. Guard posts were reinforced along vulnerable sections of the railroad. Searchlight batteries were installed at key positions. Radio stations monitored frequencies for submarine communications. The Japanese were hunting for USS Barb with everything they had. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo painted a disturbing picture. 60 rocket strikes in 3 weeks. Paper mills destroyed at Kashiho. Leather tanneries burning at Shikuka. Small shipyards reduced to wreckage at Shiratori. Factory production dropping 40% in attacked towns. Civilian morale collapsing. Workers refusing night shifts near the coast. This wasn't random harassment. This was systematic destruction of military infrastructure. And the psychological impact was devastating. If American submarines could strike inland targets with impunity, nowhere was safe. Not factories, not warehouses, not railroad stations. The home islands themselves were under attack. Japanese Naval Command issued new orders. Patrol boats would sweep coastal waters every 2 hours. Destroyers would investigate any unusual activity. Coastal artillery crews remained on 24-hour alert. Guard posts along the railroad doubled their sentries. The orders were clear. Find that submarine and sink it. But Flucky was always 1 step ahead. He never struck the same location twice. Never followed predictable patterns. Never surfaced in the same waters 2 nights running. Barb was a ghost, invisible, untouchable, until now. Because the shore party mission changed everything. This wasn't firing rockets from 3 miles offshore. This was putting men on the ground. But there was another problem nobody had anticipated. Weather. The cloud cover Flucky was counting on to hide the 3/4 moon was unstable. Barometric pressure fluctuating. Wind patterns shifting. At 23:30 hours, just 35 minutes before the scheduled raft launch, breaks appeared in the cloud layer. Patches of moonlight illuminated the ocean surface. Flucky watched through the periscope. The clouds would close, then open, then close again. Visibility changing minute by minute. This was not the solid overcast he'd planned for. Walker approached Flucky in the conning tower. "Sir, visibility is marginal. Should we scrub? Flucky studied the sky. We've been waiting 4 days for weather. We have 5 days of patrol left. Tonight is our best chance. We go. At 23:45 hours, Barb reached position 950 yards offshore. Depth gauge showed 36 feet of water, barely enough clearance to submerge if patrol boats appeared. Flucky ordered all stop. The submarine sat motionless on the surface, a dark shadow against darker water. Through the periscope, Flucky could see the railroad embankment. No lights visible on shore. No signs of patrol activity. The conditions were as good as they would get. He gave the order. Prepare to launch rafts. The 8 men of the shore party assembled on deck at 23:55 hours. Saunders, Hatfield, Sever, Newland, Klinglesmith, Richard, Markison, Walker. Dark clothing, Mae West vests, waterproof flashlights clipped to belts, pistols holstered. The pickle jar containing 55 pounds of explosives wrapped carefully in canvas and secured in Hatfield's pack. The digging tools distributed among the group. At precisely 0:05 hours on July 23rd, the 2 rubber rafts went over the side. Saunders and Walker took the lead raft with Hatfield and Sever. The second carried Newland, Klinglesmith, Richard, and Markison. The men pushed off from Barb's hull. Paddles dipped into black water. No sound except the whisper of rubber moving through ocean. The cloud cover held. Darkness remained nearly absolute. But nearly wasn't completely. Occasional breaks in the clouds allowed moonlight through. For 10-second intervals, the rafts would be visible. Then darkness would return. The men paddled steadily, eyes adjusting to the darkness, the shoreline slowly materializing as a darker mass against the sky. 25 minutes to reach the beach. The men maintained formation, rhythm steady, no talking. The surf was light, no breakers. The rafts grounded on sand at 0:30 hours exactly, on schedule. All 8 men immediately dragged the boats above the high tide line and concealed them behind rocks and driftwood. Newland and Richard stayed as guards. Their job? Ensure escape route remained open. Signal Barb if Japanese patrols approached. The other 6 moved inland. They were now the first American combat troops on Japanese home island soil during the entire Pacific War. The terrain was worse than aerial reconnaissance suggested. High grass concealed uneven ground. Sever nearly twisted his ankle in a hidden depression. They moved slowly, testing each step. 50 yards inland, they hit a drainage ditch 3 feet deep. Water at the bottom. The men lowered themselves into cold, muddy water, climbed the opposite bank, clothing now wet and heavy. 100 yards from beach, they reached a packed earth road. Vehicle tracks visible in dirt. Saunders signaled halt. Men crouched in grass, listening. No engine sounds, no voices, no movement. They crossed quickly, one at a time, continued toward the railroad embankment. At 00:50 hours, they reached the base. Walker and Saunders climbed to examine the tracks. Rails ran north-south on raised gravel bed. Wooden ties beneath steel rails. Good visibility both directions. Too good. If Japanese patrols came, the shore party would be completely exposed. They needed to work fast. But before they could start digging, Sever grabbed Saunders' arm, pointed north. Faint vibration in the rails. Distant sound building. A train was coming. The men dropped flat in grass beside the embankment. Hatfield pulled the pickle jar tight against his chest. Vibration grew stronger. Sound became rhythmic chugging. locomotive pulling freight cars through darkness. The train appeared at 00:55 hours. No headlight. Complete blackout. The locomotive passed within 15 feet of where Americans lay hidden. Steam hissing. Wheels clacking over rail joints. Ground shaking. Freight cars followed. 15 cars. Then the train was passed. Sound fading south toward Kashiho. Saunders waited 2 full minutes. Gave signal to move. The men climbed onto embankment. Took positions. Klingel-Smith moved north along tracks 50 yards. Sever went south, same distance. Walker positioned where he could see both directions and watch the road. Saunders, Hatfield, and Markison would dig and plant the device. Hatfield selected location. Straight section where trains would travel maximum speed. No curves, no grade. Perfect. He knelt between rails and examined ties. Needed to bury explosive directly beneath rail, where locomotive weight would depress it enough to trigger microswitch. Saunders and Markison began digging. Gravel came away easily at first. 6 inches down, they hit compacted earth mixed with rocks. Digging became harder, slower. Steel shovels scraped stones. Each sound impossibly loud in darkness. Hatfield checked his watch. They'd been ashore 30 minutes. Flucky would wait 90 minutes maximum. Clock was running. At 115 hours, Sever whistled softly. Another train coming. From the south this time, moving north. Opposite direction from first train. Shore party dropped flat again. Hatfield lay beside the partially excavated hole, still clutching pickle jar. Digging tools scattered across gravel between rails. If the locomotive's headlight was on, the engineer would see everything. Mission compromised. Japanese troops would flood the area within minutes. But like the first train, this one ran complete darkness. No headlight. The locomotive thundered past at 0117. 14 cars. Hatfield counted them. Shore party remained motionless until sound faded completely north. 2 trains in 22 minutes. Railroad was more active at night than Flucky's observations suggested. Saunders motioned men back to work. Less than an hour before Barb would need to submerge. Markison attacked hole with renewed urgency. Shovel bit into compacted earth. Rocks scraped free. Saunders used pick to break harder sections. Within 15 minutes, they excavated space roughly 12 inches square and 8 inches deep, directly beneath western rail. Large enough for scuttling charge, batteries, and microswitch assembly. Hatfield removed components from pickle jar. The 55-pound scuttling charge was cylindrical metal canister, packed with high explosive. Enough to blow 3-foot hole in submarine pressure hull. Against locomotive traveling 40 miles per hour, the effect would be catastrophic. Hatfield positioned charge at bottom of hole. Packed dirt around it. Placed 3 dry cell batteries beside charge. Began wiring circuit. The microswitch was critical. Designed to close when rail above depressed under locomotive weight. Japanese locomotives typically weighed 60 to 80 tons. That weight distributed across wheels would push rail downward approximately 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Hatfield worked by touch more than sight. Waterproof flashlight provided minimal illumination directed into hole. Connected positive terminal from batteries to microswitch. Negative terminal to scuttling charge detonator. Final connection from detonator back to microswitch would complete circuit. But Hatfield left that wire disconnected. He'd make final connection last. Until then, device was safe. At 0135 hours, Hatfield had wiring completed except final connection. Looked at Saunders. Nodded. Saunders signaled Walker. Sentries pulled back. Klingelsmith returned from north. Sever from south. Walker from observation position. 6 men gathered at tracks. Hatfield made the final connection. Circuit now live. Any significant downward pressure on rail above microswitch would trigger explosion. He covered device carefully with dirt and gravel, smoothed to match surrounding ballast. No visible disturbance. Track inspector might notice slightly disturbed gravel in daylight, but locomotive engineer traveling at speed in darkness would see nothing unusual. Shore party moved off railroad embankment. Began working back toward beach. Same route reversed. Across road. Through drainage ditch. Through high grass. They moved faster now. Mission complete. Explosive armed. Every minute on Japanese soil increased discovery risk. At 0145 hours, they reached beach, where Newland and Richard waited with rafts. All 8 men dragged rafts to water and climbed aboard. Saunders checked watch. Ashore exactly 1 hour, 40 minutes. Barb would be preparing to dive. Rafts pushed off. Men began paddling towards submarine position. Distance back, 950 yards. Calm water, experienced paddlers, meant roughly 15 minutes. They were halfway when Flucky's voice cut through darkness, shouting through megaphone from conning tower. "Paddle faster! Another train coming!" The men heard it, distant locomotive building speed. Flucky had spotted train through periscope while tracking shore party return. Headlight off, but exhaust plume visible against mountain silhouette. Train approaching from north, heading directly toward section where Hatfield buried explosive. Timing was catastrophically close. Saunders and men drove paddles into water with desperate rhythm. Rafts still 400 yards from Barb. Submarine sat impossibly low in water. Flucky had moved her to within 600 yards of shore, decreasing raft distance, but putting Barb in water so shallow she'd scrape bottom if attempting crash dive. Every non-essential man aboard was on deck, watching shore and approaching train. Rafts closed distance. 300 yards. 200. Train sound grew louder. Through darkness, men paddling could see locomotive silhouette. Traveling fast, probably 40 to 45 miles per hour. Engineer making up time, pushing hard through coastal section where tracks ran straight and level. Locomotive perhaps 1 mile north of buried explosive, maybe 90 seconds away. Flucky had decision to make. Wait for rafts and risk being caught on surface when Japanese response forces arrived. Or submerge now and strand 8 men. Flucky made his choice. He ordered Barb to turn and prepare emergency dive. But he would wait. Shore party earned that much. Rafts reached Barb at 0146 6 hours. Men scrambled up hull and through deck hatches. Saunders, last man off rafts. Rubber boats cut loose and abandoned. No time to retrieve. Flucky ordered deck crew below. Sealed hatches. Barb's diesel engines rumbled. Submarine began turning away from shore, accelerating toward deeper water. At 0147 hours, on July 23, 1945, the northbound train reached section where microswitch waited. Locomotive lead wheels passed over device. 68 tons of steel and steam pressing down. Western rail depressed. Microswitch closed. Electrical circuit completed. 55 pounds of high explosive detonated directly beneath locomotive boiler. The explosion was visible from Barb, even though submarine was 700 yards offshore. Massive fireball erupted along railroad embankment. Locomotive boiler ruptured instantly. Superheated steam added to explosion. Metal fragments shot upward in fountain of burning debris. Pieces flew 200 feet into air, tumbling end over end before crashing back. Locomotive disintegrated. Boiler split into 3 sections. Drive wheels separated from chassis. Smokestack and cab section hurled forward, cartwheeling down embankment toward beach. Freight cars following had no time to brake. First car slammed into wreckage at full speed, accordioned. Second car climbed up and over first, wooden frames splintering. Third car jackknifed sideways, rolled off embankment. Cars 4 through 16 piled into growing mass of twisted metal and shattered wood. Sound reached Barb as rolling thunder echoing off coastal mountains. Fires ignited across wreckage. Ammunition and several cars began cooking off. Secondary explosions added to chaos. Flucky ordered all non-essential personnel topside to witness. Dozens of submariners crowded onto deck and conning tower, watched fires burning along Karafuto coastline. That train carried Japanese soldiers headed south to reinforce defensive positions against expected American invasion. USS Barb had just conducted the first and only Allied ground combat operation on Japanese home island soil. First time American forces set foot on enemy territory. First time submarine destroyed land target with ground team. First and only submarine to sink a train. Japanese searchlights swept water from coastal positions, looking for submarine. Searchlights from 3 different positions, coordinated patterns. Hunting. Barb still on surface, running maximum speed toward deeper water. Dark gray paint helped blend into black ocean, but if searchlight beams caught her, coastal artillery would open fire within seconds. Flucky ordered course change, angling northeast away from search pattern. Diesel engines at 150% overload, same emergency power used escaping Nam Quan Harbor. Submarine making 23 knots, leaving phosphorescent wake visible if searchlights got close enough. Depth gauge showed 48 feet. Still too shallow for safe dive, but better than 36 feet near shore. At 0200 hours, Barb crossed into 60 feet depth. Flucky gave order to dive. Submarine bow tilted downward. Ballast tanks flooded. Within 90 seconds, Barb completely submerged, leveling at periscope depth. Searchlights continued sweeping surface above, but submarine was invisible now. Flucky maintained slow speed on electric motors, minimizing noise signature. Japanese patrol boats would be launching. Submarine stayed submerged 6 hours, moving slowly away from Karafuto while Japanese forces searched coastal waters. But the mission wasn't over. Flucky had 4 days before returning to Midway. He intended to use every hour. Over next 72 hours, Barb continued attacking. July 24th, surfaced off Shari, used 4-inch deck gun to shell military radio station. Direct hits destroyed antenna array. Building on fire. July 25th, attacked small shipyard at Shiratko. Destroyed 2 wooden coastal freighters under construction. July 26th, fired final 12 rockets at military garrison on Kunashir Island, then withdrew toward open ocean. Japanese aircraft searched constantly. Reconnaissance planes crisscrossed Sea of Okhotsk, trying to locate submarine terrorizing their coast. Flucky evaded through constant movement. diving whenever aircraft spotted. On July 27th, Barb set course for Midway. 12th and final war patrol, complete. The impact was immediate and massive. Japanese military command ordered emergency increase in coastal railroad security. Guards tripled along vulnerable sections. Engineering units assigned daily track inspections. Patrol boats increased from 6 to 15 in Sea of Okhotsk. Coastal artillery crews on permanent alert. Resources diverted from defensive positions. Troops who might have reinforced beaches. Equipment that might have been used against invasion forces, all redirected to protect against one submarine. The psychological effect was devastating. If American submarines could strike inland with impunity, nowhere was safe. Coastal factories shut down night shifts. Workers refused to report. Production dropped 60% in towns within 5 miles of shoreline. Civilian morale collapsed. Military logistics disrupted. And 8 submariners had done what entire invasion armies couldn't. They'd fought on Japanese home soil and won. But here's what nobody knew at the time. USS Barb's 12th Patrol, those 4 weeks of terror along Japanese coasts, the train explosion that shocked an empire, would be the last submarine combat operations of the Pacific War. Because 13 days after Barb reached Midway, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war ended. And the crew who'd made history would face a question nobody expected. What happens to the men who did the impossible when peace arrives and nobody needs heroes anymore? From an electrician's mate who remembered childhood tricks with walnuts on railroad tracks, to 8 men paddling rubber rafts onto enemy soil with a pickle jar full of explosives. From a submarine captain who refused to accept that submarines only sank ships, to the first and only Allied ground combat operation on Japanese home islands. USS Barb had changed submarine warfare forever. Rockets launched from underwater vessels. Shore bombardment from 3 miles offshore. Ground teams inserting onto hostile territory. And one train destroyed in the most audacious attack any submarine commander ever conceived. But here's what nobody expected. The question wasn't whether these men would be remembered as heroes. The question was whether they'd survive long enough to become heroes. Because 13 days after Barb reached Midway, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war ended. And suddenly, the crew who made history faced peacetime. What happens to warriors when nobody needs warriors anymore? USS Barb arrived at Midway on August 2, 1945. The crew assembled on deck in dress uniforms, holding the submarine's battle flag. 17 patches representing ships sunk. Symbols for presidential unit citations and Navy unit commendations. Rocket and gun symbols denoting shore bombardments. 6 Navy crosses earned by crew members. 23 silver stars. 23 bronze stars. A Medal of Honor ribbon at the top, representing Flucky's award from the previous patrol. And at the bottom center, a new symbol. A Japanese locomotive. The only submarine in history to sink a train now displayed that achievement on her battle colors. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself came to Midway to greet Barb's crew. The flag was photographed for naval archives. 8 men posed with the flag, the same 8 who went ashore on Karafuto. Saunders, Hatfield, Sever, Newland, Klingelsmith, Richard, Markison, Walker. They looked like ordinary sailors, young men who might have been working factories or farms if not for the war. But they had accomplished something no military force managed during the entire Pacific conflict. They conducted offensive ground operations on Japanese home territory. The train explosion became legendary within the submarine service. Other boats attacked shore targets with deck guns. Some launched rockets like Barb. But no other submarine put men on enemy soil to destroy a target and extracted them successfully. Fluckey received his 4th Navy Cross for Barb's 12th patrol. The citation specifically mentioned the train attack and rocket bombardments. Combined with his Medal of Honor and 3 previous Navy Crosses, Fluckey became one of the most decorated submarine commanders in American naval history. But when reporters asked about achievements, he consistently deflected credit to his crew. 6 days after Barb reached Midway, atomic bombs fell. 9 days later, Japan surrendered. War ended before USS Barb could conduct another patrol. The submarine's combat career was over. 12 war patrols spanning 3 years, 5 in Atlantic Theater during early war, 7 in Pacific, where Barb compiled one of the most devastating records of any submarine in the American fleet. Official tally: 17 enemy vessels, totaling 96,628 tons, sunk. But those numbers didn't capture the full scope. The Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee reviewed Fluckey's claims after war. They confirmed destruction of escort carrier Unyo on September 17, 1944. 22,500 tons. The carrier was transporting aircraft and pilots from Japan to Philippines when Barb's torpedoes found her. Ship sank in 40 minutes. Barb also destroyed numerous smaller warships, frigates, patrol craft, coastal defense vessels. Attacks on merchant shipping strangled supply lines feeding Japanese garrisons across Pacific. But the train remained Barb's most famous kill. What made that operation remarkable wasn't just audacity. It was proof of concept. Submarines could conduct operations far beyond traditional anti-shipping warfare. They could launch missiles, bombard shore installations, insert sabotage teams onto hostile territory, and extract them successfully. The mission on Karafuto demonstrated capabilities that would define submarine warfare for the next 70 years. Fluckey's innovation with rocket launchers proved particularly prescient. In 1945, submarines launching rockets seemed like desperate improvisation, born from lack of merchant shipping to attack. But within a decade, submarines armed with guided missiles became the most powerful weapons platforms in naval arsenals. The Regulus Cruise Missile Program, Polaris Ballistic Missiles, Trident, Ohio-class submarines carrying enough nuclear firepower to destroy entire nations. All of them traced conceptual lineage back to Fluckey bolting Mark 51 rocket launcher onto Barb's deck and proving the concept worked. Today's submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent, exist because one submarine commander refused to accept that submarines only carried torpedoes. Modern Special Operations Forces inserting from submarines, Navy SEALs conducting beach reconnaissance, direct action missions launched from underwater vessels. These tactics trace back to 8 men in rubber rafts, paddling onto Karafuto with shovels and explosives. USS Barb herself had less glorious post-war fate. Decommissioned May 1947. Placed in reserve. Recommissioned 1951 for training duties. Decommissioned again February 1954. That same year underwent Guppy conversion, modernization program giving World War II submarines improved underwater performance. December 1954. Barb loaned to Italian Navy under Mutual Defense Assistance Act. Italians renamed her Enrico Tazzoli after Italian submarine commander from World War I. Submarine served Italian Navy 18 years. By 1972, obsolete, worn out, no longer economically viable to maintain. Italian government sold Enrico Tazzoli for scrap metal. Final price, approximately $100,000. Roughly cost of modest house. When Flucky learned what happened, he reportedly said, "If crew had known, they would have pooled money to buy Barb back and bring her to United States as museum ship." But by time anyone realized, Submarine was already being cut apart in Italian scrapyard. Only Barb's battle flag survived. The Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, acquired it for their collection. Visitors can see it today displayed behind glass. 17 ship symbols. The train at bottom. Medal of Honor ribbon at top. Flag tells story more eloquently than any historical account. Eugene Flucky remained in Navy after war. Served as aide to Secretary of Navy James Forrestal, then to Admiral Chester Nimitz. 1960, President Eisenhower approved promotion to Rear Admiral. Flucky commanded Amphibious Group 4. Served as President of Naval Board of Inspection and Survey. Commanded entire Pacific Submarine Force from 1964 to 1966. Finished career as Director of Naval Intelligence. Retired 1972 after 37 years service. But retirement didn't mean inactivity. Flucky and wife Marjorie moved to Portugal and opened orphanage in 1974. Ran it for 8 years, providing homes for children who lost families. Marjorie died 1979. Flucky remarried 1980 and continued orphanage work until it closed 1982. The 8 men who went ashore that night returned to ordinary post-war lives. Saunders returned to civilian work. Hatfield went back to railroad industry. The others married, raised families, worked regular jobs. They rarely spoke about what they did on Karafuto. Mission remained classified for years. Even after declassification, men didn't seek publicity. They'd been doing their jobs, following orders, trying to end war and get home. Fact that their job involved paddling ashore on enemy territory to blow up train was simply what situation required. But here's the statistic Flucky valued more than all tonnage sunk, all medals earned, all recognition received. 0. 0 Purple Hearts awarded to anyone who served under his command during 5 war patrols. 0 casualties. That statistic defined Eugene Flucky's command philosophy more than any tactical innovation or daring raid. He took calculated risks, but never reckless ones. Pushed crew to absolute limits of submarine capability, but never beyond point where training and skill could compensate for danger. 5 war patrols, hundreds of depth charge attacks, thousands of miles through minefields and shallow water, countless hours surfaced in enemy-controlled seas, and every single man who served under Flucky came home alive. But there's one detail most people don't know. The pickle jar that held 55 pounds of explosives, the device that destroyed that train. Billy Hatfield kept detailed notes of his design. After war, those notes were classified and sent to Naval Ordnance. Engineers studied Hatfield's improvised pressure switch design. The concept of weight-activated explosive devices buried beneath enemy infrastructure. That technology evolved into modern landmines, pressure-activated improvised explosive devices, the entire field of concealed ordnance triggering. Hatfield's childhood memory of cracking walnuts on railroad tracks became foundation for weapon systems used in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The railroad bomb built inside submarine torpedo room influenced military engineering for 80 years. And here's the final twist. In 1992, Fluckey published Thunder Below, his memoir commanding USS Barb. Book became required reading at Naval Academy. When asked why he wrote it 47 years after war ended, Fluckey said he wanted young officers to understand one critical lesson. Innovation doesn't come from headquarters. It comes from enlisted men willing to think creatively under pressure. From electricians who remember childhood tricks. From cooks and machinists and torpedo men who volunteer for suicide missions because they believe in their commander. Greatest naval victories weren't won by admirals sitting in Pearl Harbor. They were won by sailors cramming into forward torpedo rooms at midnight, figuring out how to blow up trains with pickle jars. From an electrician's mate third class who worked for the railroad before the war, to a weapons system that changed modern warfare. From 8 ordinary sailors in rubber rafts, to the only American ground combat troops on Japanese home islands during entire Pacific War. Eugene Fluckey and crew of USS Barb proved that greatest innovations come from necessity, creativity, and absolute refusal to accept the word impossible. They fired first submarine-launched rockets. They destroyed coastal military infrastructure. They inserted ground teams onto enemy soil. They sank 17 ships, including an aircraft carrier. And they blew up a Japanese train with 55 pounds of explosives buried beneath railroad tracks by men armed with improvised shovels and unshakable courage. 0 casualties. 12 war patrols. 1 submarine that proved submarines could do anything. That's not just naval history. That's the power of believing that the impossible is just another problem waiting for someone brave enough, creative enough, and crazy enough to solve it. And sometimes, all you need is a pickle jar, some batteries, and 8 men willing to paddle into hell because their commander brought them home every single time before.